Good morning, all the nerds out there. I hope you all are doing fine. Like in our previous session, I told you that we're gonna talk about Renaissance criticism soon, and the time is now. We're gonna talk about Renaissance criticism and all related to its movement and also critics, philosopher, everything, whatever comes in our way, right? So here you can see over your screen we are going to have a discussion on Renaissance criticism and couple of critics also. So let me take you to a little journey back in time, right? And especially to this fascinating world of Renaissance and of course its impact on literature and criticism. Now I promise you one thing, that it won't be as boring as it might sound, right? So sit back, relax, grab your coffee, and let's dive in. First, let's talk about what the Renaissance was all about, right? And it was a period of great culture and intellectual revival in Europe, remember, and that spanned roughly from the 14th to 17th century. And it was a time when people rediscovered and embraced the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. And one of the key ideas that emerged during this time was the unity of form and content. And this means that in literature, the way a story is told should be in harmony with what it's trying to convey. And it's like the perfect marriage of style and substances. Now, the Renaissance folk believed that literature was absolutely central to their culture. They saw poets and authors as the guardian, of a long literary tradition, and they took their roles very seriously. And in their eyes, these writers were kind of preserving the wisdom of the past for future generation. An important moment in Renaissance criticism was the year 1498, when they hit the literary kind of jackpot, and they got their hands on classical texts like Aristotle's Poetics, and thanks to the Latin translation by a guy named Georgia Valla, remember that, and this was a kind of game changer, and because it was Aristotle's ideas that would dominate literary criticism for centuries to come. Aristotle's Poetics, in particular, was like the Bible of literary criticism. So, especially during the Renaissance, and it was all about dissecting drama and storytelling, and it had a profound influence on how they viewed literature. It was like the blueprint for great storytelling. Now, here's the cool part. Before the invention of printing press in the late 15th century, texts like Aristotle's were pretty exclusive and they were hand copied. Not everyone could get their hands on them, but when that magical invention called the printing press came along, it revolutionized the game, and it meant that knowledge could spread far and wide, and it was like the Renaissance internet at that time. So now let's talk about a couple of key players in Renaissance criticism. First, we have like Lodovico Castelvetro, and he was like the rock star of literary criticism in his time. He hailed from Modena, Italy, remember, and his work helped shape what we call neoclassicism. Especially when it came to drama, he was a kind of big fan of Aristotle's ideas and pushed for a tight, interpretation of the three unities as the standard drama, right? So if you ever wonder where those strict rules for plays came from, this guy had a lot to do with it. Then we have another important critic, Castiglione, who was quite the Renaissance multitasker, if you can say. He was a courtier, diplomat, soldier, and a respected author. He wrote a book called Il Cortegiano, or the Book of the Courtier, simple, right? And this book was all about antiquity and morality for the people in the royal court, and it was kind of the go-to guide for anyone who wanted to be the ideal courtier. So it was a big hit in 16th century Europe, especially among the fancy people like in royal courts. It laid out the talent and virtues like one needed to be a courtier, and it was like a guidebook on how to be kind of smoothest, most charming and sophisticated person in the room. So in that case, these two people are quite important. Now in our next slide, we're going to talk about William Caxton contribution, especially in printing press, and also we're going to talk about humanism, right? So William Caxton born in 1422, and he was not your kind of typical historical figure. He was a man of many talents, and first and foremost he was an English merchant and diplomat. But what sets him apart and makes him so, kind of significant in our discussion is his role as a writer and printer. In 1476, Caxton made history by introducing the first printing press into England, and this was a game changer for the English language and the knowledge. And you see, before Caxton, books were painstakingly copied by hands, and it was quite difficult, right? And which made them rare and expensive. So, with the printing press, what happened? He made books more accessible and affordable to a wider audience. And one interesting aspect of Caxton's story involves a woman named Margaret, and she played a very important role in convincing him to complete his translation of the Recall of the Histories of Troy. And this work, contained a story related to Thomas Elyot, and it's significant because, it helped introduce the English readers to the world of Greek mythology and classical literature. What a wonderful thing he has done, right? But Caxton's contribution didn't stop there, guys. And he is known for producing an edition of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's work, as we know, is a cornerstone of English literature, and Caxton printing press, kind of played a crucial role in preserving these tales for generations to come. And last but not least, Caxton also left his mark with his translation of Aesop's Fables in 1884, and the timeless moral stories originally attributed to the ancient Greek storyteller Aesop, and found a new audience thanks to Caxton printing press. Now let's talk about humanism here. So in the 16th century, there was this fancy word of humanist, and it was for people who were all about studying the humanities, not English and history like it happens these days, but things like grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and philosophy. And they really loved Latin and all things old and classical, all this stuff, right? And the birthplace of this movement was Italy, and it's where they dug up and talked about all those ancient Greek and Latin texts like Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero. And as you know, one of the important name is Petrarch, who we call the father of humanism, was a very big deal at that time, and he set the stage for whole thing. Then this dude, another Erasmus of Rotterdam, you must have heard, right, took the torch and ran with it, right? And he was like the rock star of humanism in the late 15th century, especially when the action moved from Italy to northern Europe. Basically, this movement was all about getting away from the boring medieval way of learning and bringing back the ancient Greek and Roman ideas. And they also loved writing about education, ethics, and politics. And there is a thing called Christian humanism also. That's when folks like Sir Philip Sidney, Edmund Spencer, and John Milton mixed the good old classic with their Christian belief. So it's like a kind of blending the old with the new. So that was all about William Caxton and his contribution into printing press, and also we talked about humanism, right? In our next slide, we're going to talk about Sir Thomas Elyot and his work, the Book of Governor, and of course we're going to talk about Roger Ascham's The Schoolmaster, right? So sit tight and let's move. So I'm going to put you somewhere, right? Imagine a time when using English as a literary language wasn't just the norm. Well, Sir Thomas Elyot was one of the first to say. He said something like that. I'm gonna put in my words. He was like, hey, let's write some cool stuff in English. And he was all about educating women too, which was pretty progressive for his time, right? And he wrote The Defense of Good Women to support learned ladies. But guys, his real masterpiece was the Book of Governor, which was dedicated to Henry VIII. And this book was all about training up a statesman the right way. Like today, we have MBA and other kind of personal development courses and all. And you must be doing one of them, right? But anyway, Elyot wasn't just into politics. He was also into ethics of education. He believed reading literature was super important, and he looked up to the ancient Greeks like Aristotle and Homer as examples of how to teach moral lessons. Even comedy, he thought, had its own moral lessons to share. Elyot was all about, cultivating young minds and encouraging a healthy outlook. He also believed in the idea of a universal order, So in his view, there was a hierarchy in the universe and humans were just a small part of it. Right. And next we're going to talk about Roger Ascham. So now you can see this guy is known for his writing and his love for the English language. And he even tutored Queen Elizabeth I in Greek and Latin. So you know he was kind of, good. And one of his famous work is Toxophilus. Very important, and sometime in exam you will get a question based on that. And in previously they have asked question based on that particular work. Toxophilus, which means basically lover of the bow. And this book was dedicated to Henry VIII, and it was all about promoting archery. Right? It sounds fun, right? I'm gonna do it. But anyway, leave it. But it was also a way to show off some serious English writing skill. It was the very first book on archery in English, as we know, and it's written as a conversation between two characters, Toxophilus and Philologus. Remember these two important names, right? And Ascham wasn't just about bows and arrows. He also wrote what? Remember, the Schoolmaster. Very important work. It's like, they are going to ask this in your exam. Any shift it can happen. But anyway, this book was inspired by a request from a Richard Sackville, remember, very important name, who wanted a tutor for his son. And it contains practical advice for young people. And Ascham was all about, for being kind to students and against harsh punishment. Good. And he was a bit of critic of some not so great themes in Morte d'Arthur too. So guys, and of course, in the second book of the Schoolmaster, he talked about the importance of learning Latin and how it's impossible without the right approach. He believed that every great poet learned from their predecessor, and he gave some cool examples to follow. So the Schoolmaster is like what we do today, right? Like B.Ed and all, related educations and all. So the Schoolmaster was the first guide, and it's quite important work that you should remember, and you won't be surprised if you get to see this work in your exam, right? So anyway, that was all about Sir Thomas Elyot's The Book of Governor, and of course we talked about Roger Ascham's The Schoolmaster. Now let's quickly move to another important figure. Actually, we're gonna cover two critics at that time, George Gascoigne and of course George Puttenham, The Art of English Poesie. So are you ready, guys? So these two gentlemen made significant contribution to the world of poetry and prose during their time, and their insights continue to enrich our understanding of the literary traditions of that period. So first off, let's start with George Gascoigne here, and he was a poet and dramatist who lived in the 16th century, a time when poetry was kind of flourishing in the courts of Queen Elizabeth I. And Gascoigne's works were considered among the most important of the early Elizabethan era, and following in the footsteps of luminaries like we have Sir Thomas Wyatt, Henry Howard, and Philip Sidney. And one of his most intriguing works was a discourse of the adventure of Master F.J., written in 1573. Piece is like a window into the courtly intrigue of the time, and it's often regarded as one of the early examples of English prose fiction. So in it, Gascoigne captured the intrigues and kind of escapades of the court, and providing a fascinating look into the politics and society of his era. But that's not all, guys. He is also known for his role in establishing the cult of Queen Elizabeth I. He was the first poet to defy the queen and portray her as a virgin goddess, married to her kingdom and subject. And this played a crucial part in shaping the image of the queen in the eyes of her subjects. Now let's turn our attention to his essay, Certain Notes on Instruction Concerning the Making of Verse or Rhyme in English, which was written in 1575. And this essay is considered the first of its kind in English versification. In it, he delved into the kind of technical aspects of versification, discussing kind of sanction and word order, stanzas, and the form and rhyme and other schemes, right? And he emphasized the importance of the fine invention and urging poets to use creative and imaginative expression to hide the obvious and to avoid conventional conceit. And of course, obvious terms. So in other words, he encouraged poet to be innovative and to surprise their readers with their craft. So next we have Puttenham, right? And he's a literary critic and writer from the same period, and he authored the Art of English Poesie, and it's quite important, which was published in 1589, which is highly influential handbook on poetry and rhetoric. So in this work, Puttenham made kind of some profound observation about the role of poets in society. He regarded poets as the first priests, prophets, legislators, and politicians in human history, a notion that speaks to the cultural importance of poetry in his time. Puttenham works also classifies different types of poetry, guys, and these includes like religious, didactic, satirical, epitaph. He didn't just praise the poets of his time, he also criticized their predecessors, including Wyatt and Surrey, of course, Chaucer, Gower, and Raleigh also. And his insights provide a fascinating window into the evolving literary landscape of the Elizabethan era. In the work, The Art of English Poesie, Puttenham's second section, called a Proportion Poetical, is a visual treat. He describes various shapes of stanzas like triangles, pillars, tapers, and of course some others. So according to him, these shapes enhances the visual appeal of verses, making them more attractive to readers. It's an kind of intriguing perspective on the aesthetics of poetry. However, it's worth noting that Puttenham's understanding of meter wasn't as strong as his other literary insights, and he did struggle with scanning poetry. Nevertheless, his work in the third section called of ornament is valuable, as he illustrates various figurative devices used in versification. So guys, that was all about Gascoigne and Puttenham. Now we're gonna quickly move to another important figure at that time was Stephen Gosson, and his work, The School of Abuse, everybody is aware of, and it's kind of certain that you're gonna get a question based on that also. But anyway, let me tell you who this guy is. So Mr. Gosson, as we know, he was an English satirist, and it seemed he had a quite kind of bone to pick with a bunch of works of his time. Guess what? After he got kind of a school of abuse of his chest, he decided to take a step back from city life and became a tutor for some gentleman's kid. Now let's quickly move to one of his important work, The School of Abuse. As we know, it is published in 1579, and as you can see, the whole title is containing a pleasant invective against poets, pipers, players, jesters, and such like caterpillars of commonwealth. Right. And Gosson's main kind of purpose was with the theater of his day. He wasn't kind of fan of what was happening on the stage back then. He thought that contemporary theater lacked purpose and that it was being used to promote the business of, well, what can you guess, prostitutes. And yeah, he wasn't too pleased with the this going on in the theater of his time. In his other writing, Gosson didn't hold back either, like tragedies, according to him, were filled with evil and criminal themes and settings. He thought they were just a bad influence, to put it mildly. As for comedies, he accused them, of being full of bawdy humor, flattery, and all around immorality. It seems he didn't find much to laugh about, right? But anyway, then there were the characters in this place. So according to Gosson, so these characters, they were all drawn from all sorts of background. It started with something like cooks to knives to parasite, all these. So he didn't seem to have a very high opinion of the false portrait on the stage as well, right? And now here's an interesting fact, I'm gonna put it. Gosson dedicated this particular book, who can you guess? This work, The School of Abuse, to none other than our Sir Philip Sidney, who was a bit of literary rock star in his day. So you can see that Gosson was pretty serious about his critique. So in conclusion, if you want me to put, Stephen Gosson was a satirist, right, with a lot to say about the theater and the culture of his time. He thought it was all about kind of bit too immoral for his taste. His writings are fascinating glimpse into the world of late 16th century England, and they certainly make for some entertaining reading. So next time you're at the theater or enjoying a play, think about Mr. Gosson, what he might have to say about it, right? So anyway, that was all about Stephen Gosson and his work, The School of Abuse. Now we'll quickly move to another important giant who basically is the major critic at that time, Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. Remember, we have a special session on Philip Sidney alone. You can watch that one also. So here I'm gonna be a little bit brief about him and his work, but we'll make sure that I put every single important points in this particular slide. So as you can see, and if you want all these PPTs, remember what you have to do, go to our app and download all these PPTs. And remember, we have a series of like, plus 3 or maybe 10,000 plus questions on simply on criticism, culture and theory. So do not miss it. It's very important, and I'm sure like 30 plus question you're gonna get from that. So even if you don't have time to do this, these tests, you can just watch these videos and I'm sure you're gonna get, of course, as I said, 30 plus question, and that can play a huge role in your success, right? So now let's talk about, a true Renaissance man of the Elizabethan era. Who was it? Philip Sidney, Sir Philip Sidney, in fact, right? And he was a poet, courtier, scholar, and soldier, and his influence on the world of literature is kind of undeniable, right? Now let's talk about some of his most significant work, right? We have like Astrophel and Stella, a collection of sonnets that explore themes of love and desire. It's a beautiful example of Sidney's poetic powers, if you wanna go and check it out. But anyway, as I told you, we have a special session on Philip Sidney. You can go and watch. By the way, perhaps his most famous work is, guess what? As you can see over your screen, An Apology for Poetry, also known as The Defense of Poetry. So this piece was written around 1580 but published posthumously in 1595. It's a profound exploration of the value of poetry and its defense against critics, notably against who? Stephen Gosson, that we have discussed in our previous slide, right? And his work, attacked what? The English stage. Stephen Gosson's work attacked what? The English stage. So it was a reply for that. So Sidney addresses some general objection to the poetry, some of which dates back to Plato. Remember, he identifies 3 kinds of poetry. Very important: religious, philosophical, and imaginative. Very important that you have to remember, because most of the time they're asking question based on that. So he argues that poetry is a way to create a separate reality, a realm where the poet is a creator and where the true poet must both teach and delight, a concept rooted in the traditions of Horace. So one of the key points Sidney makes is that poets are not liar. Who's he is referring? He's referring to Plato, right? Plato called that poets are liar and they should be banned from the idealist state. But here, on the other hand, Sidney makes the point that poets are not liars. So unlike some other forms of communication, poets didn't claim to know the ultimate truth, right? And they don't encircle your imagination or rely solely on authority. They are, in a sense, the least liar or the least deceivers. Very important point that you should remember. So Sidney also takes a dig at drama. And can you guess what he has to say about drama? He, claiming it, often neglects rules of civility and poetic skills. He sees that poetry as a path to virtue, superior even to history and philosophy. So he's putting poetry above history, philosophy, and every kind of genre. So as it not only infamous but also inspires and instruct. Remember that, inspires and instruct. So now let's break down this structure of apology, right? First of all, it's divided into several sections, including, remember the name, exordium, narration, propositio, confirmation, perfection, reflection, digression, and peroration. So each section contributes to his overall argument, providing a well-structured and compelling defense of poetry. He categorized poetry into various genres. Can you guess what? Each with its own purpose and impact. Let me tell you the first. Epic and heroic poetry aim to uplift and inspire. Very important point that you should remember. While pastoral poetry, on the other hand, connects us to the simple joy of everyday life. Again, Elegy. So this kind of elegiac poetry evokes pity. Iambic poetry exposes wickedness. Remember that, iambic poetry. And the satire, on the other hand, boldly criticizes society. Remember, comedy brings laughter and highlights human folly, and of course, tragedy instills awe and examines the uncertainties of life. So remember, all these points are quite important. I have put it in the slide that you can go and look. And remember that Sidney also advocates for the moral and intellectual benefits of poetry. He believed it, that this poetry promotes virtues and argues that poets are not the deceivers, guys. They have been made out to be like from Plato, right? And instead he blames kind of, instead he blames the misuse of poetry for its decline and the decline of drama. So anyway, guys, that was a quick rundown on Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry, and I made sure that I have covered all the important points from exam perspective. But anyway, if you really want to explore more about it, Philip Sidney, you can always go back and watch special session on Philip Sidney. Very important. We have covered kind of whole text. So if you want to study in depth, you can go and watch. By the way, that was all about Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. Now I'm gonna take you where Thomas Elyot's Defense of Poetry, Music and Stage Plays, and of course Sir John Harrington. They both are important, and why, that we're gonna explore here. So first, about Thomas Elyot. Imagine being in a time when the world of literature was in turmoil, where poetry was under attack all the time. Everybody was just attacking poetry. Our first hero here, Thomas Elyot, was not only a writer but also a kind of medical practitioner. He lived through both the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods, and during his time, Stephen Gosson, right, who published, and of course, a School of Abuse, kind of criticism that we already discussed. And in response, what Lodge penned his defense of poetry, music, and stage plays. So if you're wondering that Philip Sidney is the only one who wrote in the reply, but it's not. It was all the other works that you're gonna get. You will get other critics who defended poetry or literature against Stephen Gosson, and that I'm gonna tell you very soon. So it first was Lodge, who penned his defense of poetry, music, and stage plays, right? And it was published in 1580. And Lodge's defense is an interesting read if you wanna go and read. He didn't deny that there were some wayward poets, but he argued that their action shouldn't condemn the entire lot, right? And his words carried both restraint and wisdom. And of course, although the pamphlet was banned, it managed to circulate privately. And Gosson wasn't going to back down. So he again fired back and wrote what? Players confuted in 5 actions. So remember, the fight was not just started from a School of Abuse. There was clash of these people, clash of Philip Sidney, Thomas Elyot, or Campion, or Samuel Daniel. They were all fighting together. They were writing, replying each other's work, right? Lodge never wanted to shy away from a literary brawl, and guess what? He responded with another work called Alarum Against Usurers in 1584. Next, we're going to talk about John Harrington, who is our second champion. And Sir John Harrington came to the rescue of poetry with his work called A Brief Apology for Poetry. He included it as a preface to his translation of Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, right? And it was published in 1591, making it the first English translation of this particular work. So in this apology, Harrington waxes, kind of eloquent about the many layers of meaning that poetry can convey. And it can be, like historical, moral, allegorical, and more. And he dives into the art of allegory and explains the advantages of verse. Harrington believed that poetry was not just a medium of artistic expression, but a tool that could lead people to become more honest and wise. He substantiated his claims with examples from poets like Homer and Dante. So in a nutshell, what we have here is a tale of two defenders of poetry, right? Lodge who was also the medical practitioner and writer, right, who wrote passionately defense in the face of criticism, while Sir John Harrington championed the virtue of poetry through his work Apology. Both of them, in their unique ways, upheld the power of poetry, ensuring that it continued to thrive in a world that sometimes questioned the truth, right? And that was all about. Now I'm gonna give you two more important defender of the poetry at that time, Thomas Campion and of course Samuel Daniel, right? So our main contender in this verbal duel are Thomas Campion and Samuel Daniel, and two prominent figure of their time, right? So let me tell you the first critic here, Thomas Campion. He was a kind of multi-talented master, and first up, he was a true Renaissance man of the 16th and 17th century, born in the bustling metropolis of London. And Campion was not content with just one profession. He dabbled into, composing poetry and even medicine. So this man has a talent that has kind of, no bounds. And Campion was a learned fellow too, having studied law at Grey Inns and graduating from the prestigious college, as we know, Cambridge University. And he's primarily known for his over 100 lute songs, and that set many heart, fluter. His mask was kind of, dancing, added a dash of a spectacle to this era's entertainment. But anyway, one of his most notable contribution was his treatise on music, and it's his work observation in the art of English poesy that sparked a bit of controversy. And in this treatise, Campion was kind of a rhyme rebel, arguing in favor of rhymeless verse that harked back to classical quantitative verse. And it was a bold move, and not everyone was a fan of his work. And guess who replied? Samuel Daniel. And he's our second challenger, Samuel Daniel, right? He was a contemporary of Campion, and Daniel was a poet, and also a playwright and historian, and a kind of true triple threat of the literary world. He's perhaps best known for his sonnet cycle, as we know, Delia, which melted hearts and made readers kind of swoon. Yet Daniel wasn't just about sweet verses. He also engaged in dialogues literally with his work Musophilus, remember, which was a dialogue in verse. In it, he discussed the role of the poet in society, adding depth to his poetical arsenal. Now you must be wondering why we have mentioned here. Well, because of his defense of rhyme. This piece was a direct response to Campion's observation in the art of English poesy. And Daniel was not having any of Campion's rhymeless verse kind of, technique. In his treatise, he took a stand for rhyme, defending its place in English poetry and opposing Campion's call for return to classical forms. And these folks, have kind of, true clash of titans on our hand, if you can say. And Campion's anti-rhyme, stance versus Daniel's resolute defense of rhyme. This feud, brought the age-old question of poetic tradition to the forefront. And imagine them going toe-to-toe in a verbal sparring match with words as their weapon and the hearts and minds of the literary world hanging in the balance. It's a kind of fascinating glimpse into the heated debate of the 17th century. So in that case, these two figure are quite important in Renaissance criticism, and exactly that's the reason why we have put them here. Now we're going to talk about Francis Bacon. He's quite important in Renaissance criticism, and let me tell you why. So Sir Francis Bacon, as we know, has a kind of multi-talents, and he lived in the late 16th and early 17th century and was more than just your average philosopher and statesman. First and foremost, Bacon was known for his contribution to the scientific method, and he held prestigious position at the both Attorney General and of course Lord Chancellor, making him quite the influential figure in his day. He is often hailed as the father of empiricism, and I guess most of you are familiar of it. Well, that empiricism is a kind of way of thinking that places great emphasis on careful observation and inductive reasoning. Now let's dive into his notable work, The Advancement of Learning. As you can see over your screen, we have certain points here, and first of all, it was published in 1605. The full title of the book is Of the Proficience and Advancement of Learning, Divine and Human. And this book laid the foundation of future kind of encyclopedias, like the famous encyclopedia by D. Albert and Diderot, right? And Bacon divided human understanding into three segments. Remember, memory, which relates to history; imagination, which relates to poetry; and reason, which relates to philosophy. He had a soft spot for poetry also, claiming it to be superior since it combines imagination with reasoning and isn't bound for just by mere facts or history. In his eyes, poetry is like fiend history, and where the most significant and heroic events they take place, and it's where actions are portrayed more justly and fairly than in real life. Bacon also delved into different types of poetry in this book. Can you guess? There is one narrative poetry, which is like an imitation of history. And again, there is another poetry called representative poetry, where the action plays out on the stage in dramatic form. So according to him, poets even outshine philosophers when it comes to examining and expressing human conditions, and also compulsions, customs, and corruption. And however, he does place orators above poets when it comes to wit and eloquence. One fascinating analogy he makes in the advancement of learning is about tennis. He draws kind of parallel between the games of tennis and mathematics. Just as tennis is a game of no practical use in itself but sharpens one's eye and agility, mathematics serves as an intellectual exercise that may not have immediate practical application, but kind of hones the mind and critical thinking. It's an interesting perspective comparing two seemingly unrelated activities to highlight the value of both, right? So in a summary, Francis Bacon was a true Renaissance man, deeply rooted in his time as a humanist and empiricist, and his work in advancement of learning not only kind of shaped his era but also left a lasting impact on the course of knowledge and philosophy. And Bacon's belief in the power of observation and the imaginative world of poetry shows that he was a thinker ahead of his time. Right now, our next and the last slide, you can see about John Milton's. Of course, we're going to talk about Areopagitica, which was published in 1644, and of course we're going to talk about Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce a little bit. Quite important track that you have to remember. But anyway, let me tell you, as we know, Milton was born in 1608 and lived during a turbulent period in English history. He was not just a poet but also a civil servant who worked under Oliver Cromwell, and he was also the Council of State during the Commonwealth of England. This early political involvement would significantly influence his later work. So Milton is best known, as we know, for his epic poem Paradise Lost, which was written in blank verse, and this masterpiece was published in 1667, and it retells the biblical story of the fall of a man and Satan's rebellion, right? What's remarkable about it is that Milton's desire for freedom is evident in his style. He introduced new words into the English language and was the first modern writer to use unrhymed verses outside the theater of translation. And his bold approach to language reflects his commitment to individual expression and creativity. And why we have mentioned Milton in Renaissance criticism, because of his unyielding spirit wasn't limited to his poetic endeavors. In 1643, during the English Civil War, he wrote the Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, and this work, presented to the Westminster Assembly of Divines, sparked significant controversy. At the time, divorce was a contentious issue, and Milton's view on it was seen as heretical by the orthodox Presbyterians. He believed in divorce as a private matter, not a legal, and expressed his support for polygamy in his theological treatise De Doctrina Christiana. Right. And however, Milton's ideas on divorce were not entirely out of step, and many influential Christian intellectuals, including some of the Westminster divines, held similar views. In fact, the Westminster Assembly itself, allowed for divorce in case of infidelity or abandonment. And this suggests that Milton's view were not as radical as they might have seemed in his time. And one of the important, and most powerful and enduring work is Areopagitica, and this is a speech he, delivered in 1644, and its full title is Areopagitica, a speech of John Milton for the liberty of unlicensed printing on the Parliament of England. In this speech, he vehemently, condemned pre-publication censorship and made an eloquent and passionate defense of freedom of speech and the press. It is considered one of the most effective and dynamic argument for these freedoms, right? And Milton's unwavering commitment to freedom, be it in the realm of literature and public discourse, and sets him apart as a visionary of his time. So he believed that individuals should have the liberty to express their thoughts without restraint, a principle that is still, resonate with us today. So in conclusion, John Milton was a poet, writer, and intellectual who left an incredible mark on English literature. And the fight for the freedom of expression, his life was marked by controversy, but it was also defined by his unwavering belief in individual liberty and the power of words. So let us remember John Milton as a true champion of freedom and as a source of inspiration for generations to come. Right? And thank you for joining me today on this journey on Renaissance criticism. We have covered every single philosopher, critic, and thinker at that time, and also important works. And I'm sure at least 2 or 3 questions you might face, from this particular session. Anyway, thank you so much. And tomorrow I'm going to bring you one more session which will be on Marxism. So, and make sure you subscribe the channel and hit that bell icon so you don't miss any single important session. Right? So thank you so much. And one more thing, if you really wanna explore more about these session, you can just do MCQs that we have in the app, and also if you want these PPTs, you will find it there as well. So thank you so much and have a great day. Bye bye.